Hey everyone. Thanks for checking out this very first episode of the America in World War II podcast. My name is Rich, and if you've listened to a certain Civil War podcast that my wife Tracy and I have done for the past 12 years, then yes, I'm that rich. And this is a different podcast, obviously. Tracy and I actually started a World War II podcast several years ago and got about 24 episodes into it before we set it aside. We looked at the aftermath of the First World War, the rise of the Nazis in Germany, then what happened with Austria and Czechoslovakia, and we got up to the invasion of Poland. You see, our original idea had been to release Civil War and World War II episodes on alternating weeks, but it became obvious that the Civil War listeners weren't terribly happy with that new schedule, where they only got an episode every other week. So, because the natives were restless, we went back to focusing on just the Civil War podcast. But since then, I've always had an itch to return to World War II. And now, since Tracy and I have started to head down the home stretch with the other show, I thought it'd be a good time to return to the Second World War. And since you're probably wondering by now, yes, I'll be flying solo with this new World War II podcast. Tracy and I may be heading down the home stretch with the Civil War, but we're still plugging away at it, and Tracy's work schedule and job responsibilities wouldn't really allow her to do two podcasts right now, so I'll be tackling World War II by myself. There is the possibility Tracy may drop in for some guest appearances in the future, but we'll have to see. All right, so after answering the "Where's Tracy?" question, let's get to your second question. Rich, why a America and World War II podcast? Well, while I am excited to be returning to World War II, tackling the entirety of the Civil War and Reconstruction has given me an appreciation for what all is involved in sitting down to do a podcast. So here, with this new show, I thought it might be a good idea to try to narrow down the subject matter. And my solution was to focus on America in World War II. As you might guess from my podcasts, history has always been my thing, and the American Civil War and World War II have always been my special areas of interest. My bachelor's was in history and also secondary education. I taught high school social studies for a short while after college before moving on to other pursuits. I think the story of the Civil War has always fascinated me because of the very idea that once upon a time, two parts of our nation were engaged in a bitter fight to the death with one another. And as far as World War II, well, I blame my grandfathers. My maternal grandfather was a combat infantryman in Europe, and my paternal grandfather served as a sailor on a ship in the Pacific. My grandpa Youngdahl was an over-the-road truck driver most of his life, and I suppose because of all those lonely hours he spent driving, he relished talking to anyone when he had the chance. So I heard his war stories many times, over and over. On the other hand, my grandpa Bertie didn't talk as much about his experiences during the war. Just every once in a while, he'd share something. Like if I was working on a model Sherman tank, he'd say the infantrymen hated it when the tanks came up to the front lines because they drew German artillery fire. Little things like that. But then, after I started college at Penn State, he decided to do some major renovations to their home, and that summer hired me to help him. And that summer he opened up and shared story after story with me. Sadly, like almost all of our World War II veterans now, my grandfathers have passed away. So today I cherish those stories that they shared with me. They both left small towns in western Pennsylvania to go across the world to fight against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And I'm thankful they both returned safely to those same small towns in western Pennsylvania, or I wouldn't be here. But I'd like to dedicate this podcast to the memory of Staff Sergeant Alan Bertie, who served in the 76th Infantry Division in the European Theater of Operations, and to the memory of Machinist Mate Petty Officer 3rd Class Richard Youngdahl, who served on the USS Winged Arrow in the Pacific Theater of Operations. I'm proud to be their grandson. Okay, then I just wanted to let you know what this podcast will look like going forward. It will primarily be a military history podcast, and I'm going to try to do my best to make each episode a standalone entity. You know, with the Civil War podcast, we might have a story arc that's 8 episodes long, with each show connected one to the other, meant to be listened to one after another, so they form a whole. But here what I'd like to do is have each episode be a story unto itself. So I may have 4 episodes on Pearl Harbor, or 6 covering D-Day. And while each of those shows will drill down and look at a different part of the battle or campaign, each will also give you enough of the larger story that you can listen to any one of them and still understand what happened, big picture, at Pearl Harbor or on D-Day. I hope that makes sense. I'll work my way more or less chronologically through the war years, 1941 through 1945, but I'll also be starting off with some episodes about what happened before the United States officially entered the war. And later on, we'll also talk about some things that happened after the war. Now, with this very first episode, I do want to share a little story with you all that features a Civil War, Second World War connection. To start off, we're going to go back to the summer of 1861, so very early in the American Civil War. And James Harmon Ward is being buried in his hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. One of the local newspapers reported the city's streets were filled with a, quote, saddened concourse of people. But the funeral of Commander Ward of the U.S. Navy would only briefly hold the public's attention. His death would soon be largely forgotten as the awful war went on, and more than 600,000 additional deaths traumatized the divided nation. However, Ward had a notable career in the U.S. Navy. He played an instrumental role in the 1840s in the formation of the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland. He was one of its first 7 faculty members. He was a scholar, writing treatises on naval gunnery, naval tactics, and the future of steam propulsion. But he also went to sea, first as a midshipman assigned to the frigate USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. His Naval Academy stint ended with the resumption of sea duty during the Mexican War, when he served as captain of the frigate USS Cumberland. Next, while commanding the sloop Jamestown off Africa, Ward wrote his Manual of Naval Tactics, which would soon become a textbook at the Academy. With the start of the Civil War in April 1861, there was really no doubt where the 54-year-old officer's loyalties lay. He would remain with the Union. Ward was given command of the Potomac Flotilla, an assembly of gunboats and other vessels operating on the Potomac River. Led by Ward, the flotilla shelled Confederate batteries at Aquia Creek in May and June, then attempted a landing at Matthias Point on June 27th. It was there that Commander Ward was struck down by an enemy bullet. James Harmon Ward was the first U.S. Navy officer killed in action during the Civil War, and a grateful nation named one of the forts that guarded Washington, D.C. for the fallen hero. But his name was destined to live on in yet another aspect, in connection with another war, because 80 years after his death in 1861, on the fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, the destroyer USS Ward was at Pearl Harbor. On patrol early that morning outside the entrance to the harbor, before the start of the Japanese aerial attack, Ward, commanded by Lieutenant William Outerbridge, engaged and sank a Japanese midget sub that was attempting to enter Pearl Harbor by following a cargo ship through the anti-submarine nets at the harbor entrance. And so Outerbridge and Ward are credited with firing the first shots of the Pacific War for the United States there at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, 1941. After that, Ward, commissioned back in 1918 for duty in the First World War, was converted into a fast transport and did yeoman's work in the Pacific until 3 years later, in 1944, another December 7th rolled around. That day, a Japanese suicide plane caught Ward in Ormoc Bay during the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines, crashing into her hull amidships. As uncontrollable fires erupted aboard the stricken vessel, the crew was ordered to abandon ship. After every crew member was safe, the nearby destroyer O'Brien opened fire with her guns to sink Ward. And, in an amazing coincidence, commanding O'Brien that day was none other than William Outerbridge, the same man who had captained Ward 3 years earlier at Pearl Harbor. So, there you go. I thought that was a fascinating little story with an interesting Civil War, World War II connection. I hope you liked it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. You know, with every episode of our Civil War podcast, Tracy and I give a book recommendation, since it's our hope that what we talk about on the show might spur listeners to explore that subject more deeply on their own. And I'd like to do the same thing here with this World War II podcast. So whenever you hear that bugle call, you'll know it's time for the episode's book recommendation as I wrap up the show. And with this very first episode, the book recommendation is a nostalgic one. Because when I was a kid, I would go to the library and check out the books of the Time Life series on World War II. You know the series I mean? The large books with wraparound photographic covers and the red lettering on the spine? Man, I would check those out of the library and spend hours reading them and looking at the photos and illustrations. So, along with my grandfathers, I blame those books for my lifelong passion for World War II. They're on my bookshelf today, and every once in a while I'll still pull one out and look through it. Really quick, let me give you some contact info. I just got a website for the show up and running. It's americaww2podcast.org. And I also have an email address for the show. It's americaww2podcast@gmail.com. All right, and with that, I'll just say thank you, everyone. Thanks for listening to the first episode of the America in World War II podcast. I do hope that you join me again next time, but until then, take care.